Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin. The American people need to have confidence that government officials in all three branches are serving the public interest, not their personal interests. And the Supreme Court, as I think this hearing has demonstrated, suffers today from a lack of transparency and accountability when it comes to ethics practices. This is true for justices appointed by presidents of both parties. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is an issue of transparency, accountability, and confidence. Last year, I led the successful passage of the Courthouse Ethics and Transparency Act, joined by Senator Cornyn, many Republicans. It was actually adopted unanimously. It's simple. It requires federal judges, including on the Supreme Court, to promptly report when they sell securities so the public is made aware of any potential conflict due to a financial interest. Members of Congress have had to comply with the same requirements, so we made sure that federal judges, all federal judges, should have to play by similar rules. Still, the Supreme Court is today subject to weaker ethical obligations than other branches of our government. I want to explore some of those differences briefly now. Mr. Payne, if I might, one obvious difference between Congress and the Supreme Court is the court has no formal mechanism to provide guidance, investigate allegations, or enforce ethical constraints on the justices. I'm the chair of the Senate Ethics Committee and have seen firsthand the value of similar structures. Why has the court failed to create a similar ethics body, and could it do so at any moment if it chose to?
It is unclear why the court has decided not to establish such an internal body. It is just a basic principle with any rules to have an enforcement or compliance mechanism internally. And they could create this immediately. All they need is to establish an office within the Supreme Court that has ethics experts who are professionals who can provide advice on the existing rules and can handle any new rules that are enacted.
If one were seeking ethics guidance as a member of the executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, and you simply turned to your colleagues rather than a professional office that was responsible for providing uniform and impartial advice, would you be practicing at the highest level in terms of your compliance with ethics rules and regulations? No.
No. If you rely on colleagues or anyone who is not providing guidance across the board, the advice will not be consistent and won't necessarily be correct.
In his response to this committee, to the letter from the chairman, Chief Justice Roberts noted the Supreme Court adopted a resolution in 1991 to comply with the Judicial Conference's financial disclosure regulations. But the court has declined to adopt a similar resolution that would bind the justices to the Judicial Conference's Code of Conduct. Why has the court agreed to comply with the conference's disclosure rules, but not its broader ethics rules? And could the justices easily bind themselves to the Code of Conduct if they so chose?
It is unclear why the justices decided to only bind themselves with the regulations. However, I point out that the Ethics in Government Act applies to the justices, so they really don't have the option to opt out. But they could easily establish a code of conduct for themselves to have rules that are applicable to them and can be enforced.
And is there any significant distinction among the other members of the Article III federal judiciary in terms of their report requirements, their disclosure, and their ability to have their conduct reviewed by an independent and impartial enforcement body? Is there any variation among the rest of the Article III judiciary?
Yes. Unlike the Supreme Court, all of the lower court judges are bound by the same financial disclosure requirements, but they do have the Judicial Conference that can provide ethics advice that is available online, even in advisory opinions, such that it is clear what the rules are, how they apply, and what happens if there's noncompliance.
Last question, if I might, Professor Frost, Ms. Frost. Chief Justice Roberts has said it would be inappropriate for the Judicial Conference to supervise the Supreme Court. At the same time, he suggested he believes the court can't be constrained by Congress. That concept's been raised here today as well. In that view, only the court itself would be able to enforce its own ethics requirements. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, that seems to be the position.
And it seems to me that's the equivalent of saying that they alone should be able to grade their own homework. I think Congress can legislate here if necessary. It may not be the most desirable outcome, but it is possible. In fact, I think we passed the Courthouse Ethics and Transparency Act by voice vote last year. Colleagues on both sides of the aisle co-sponsored this bill. Can you explain how we can reconcile this kind of legislation with the key principle of separation of powers?
Yes, that's because we're not talking about interfering with the court's decisional independence. We're not talking about penalizing justices for their votes in any cases. We're talking about the checks and balances that exist for all three branches, where Congress plays a role in establishing the administration of the courts. The Constitution requires that. And it's part and parcel of that establishes ethical guidelines.
In fact, I'd argue, Mr. Chairman, in closing, that if the most senior members of the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch are all subject to disclosure and reporting and compliance and enforcement obligations, for just one court of 9 justices to exempt themselves puts us at real risk of the highest court having the lowest ethical standards of the entire senior members of all 3 branches. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.